this is infuriating. I mean, I don't know what to do, but we just keep going, folks. We just keep going. Here we are. If someone can post the link in the old stream so people know where we're at, we're just going to keep going. If people have more super chat questions, keep them rolling in. I can be on here. I got a little while here. We can just keep doing it. This is how I'm doing my afternoon. Hit the like button again. Don't forget to hit the like button again since we started yet another stream. But here we are. I'm still here. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. We just keep going. We just keep going. We're not stopping. And we keep going. But yeah, so the point that I was making, and if you, before I get back to what I'm saying, please, send a super chat if you want me to keep talking. I've got more stuff to talk about. But anyway, so the point is that a group of colonized people within U.S. borders, right, an oppressed nation, has the absolute right to reject all things associated with the United States, to reject American patriotism. And I support that. And that's different, right? Arguing that patriotic socialism is an effective form of mass marketing and as an effective form of communicating with people in the United States to understand that we want to make the country better, that we're not their enemy, that we're not trying to destroy them, we're not trying to make them miserable, that's an effective way of doing that and making clear we want to make a better country, that we love the American people, we want to improve their lives. That's very different than colonized groups saying we reject America, we want to be separate. That's different. And I don't pour any condemnation on oppressed people for doing that. And I understand why they would feel that way. But I'm talking about how do we market socialism to the broad masses of Americans, And I'm careful with the question of separation because of the fact that there is not a clear consensus among black people in the United States, for example, that they want a separate state. There are certainly groups like the Nation of Islam and the Black Panthers and others that, the new Black Panther Party, that clearly want a separate state. Well, there are many black people who don't want a separate state. So if I were to go around advocating a separate state for black people, as a white guy, that would sound like I was in favor of segregation. That would say like I'm in favor of that would not come across very well. So, I support the right of colonized people to reject things associated with America. I support the right. Of indigenous people or Chicano people to say we don't consider ourselves to be American and we reject symbols of the United States. That's very different than saying that in order to win the broad masses of people over to socialism, we should make clear that we love the country and we want to make a better country. And we're not hostile to the people that would benefit from dismantling imperialism and building a socialist society in this country. And I don't understand, again, why the rush, when I say I'm an American patriotism, it's like, blah, this rage just comes out, blah, and it's like, I'm accused of saying all these things I never said. I'm accused of taking all kinds of positions I do not take. I'm saying that we need to make a better country. That's all I'm saying. I'm saying that socialism is about making your life better and improving the country. And if you're a serious political leader, you want to communicate that to people. You want people to understand that your political current will make their lives better. If there's an election happening, and it's a choice between candidates who want to make the world a better place and will make your life better and candidates who don't want to make your life better, people tend to vote for the one that they think will make their life better. I mean, it's pretty simple. So, saying that you're an American patriot at the same time that you're an anti-racist and an anti-imperialist, it's just common sense. It's just common sense. But there's this, this hostility from people. So again, I did a whole rant about that, before we got interrupted again. But here we are. Now, the next super chat question I've got here. Someone said, decentralization is only possible with a central structure, right? And there's some irony there, isn't there, right? That, that's one of those contradictions, right? Right? They talk about how, in order to end war and imperialism, you have to get rid of capitalism. And so in order to move toward a socialist world, there are various people in places like Vietnam and China and elsewhere that have had to engage in war because they want to end war. They talk about all kinds of things, right? That you have to do the opposite of what you're trying to do in order to achieve it, right? They talk about that, right? And it seems contradictory, and that yes, right, by building a centrally planned economy and eradicating scarcity, raising people out of poverty, getting rid of scarcity, we could lay the basis for decentralization, right? That's the idea, right? Eventually, with socialism, with a centrally planned economy, enough efficiency could be built up that eventually that centralization could start to break down and people could be more able to just kind of do what they feel like, etc. And that's a contradictory aspect of Marxism, right? This idea that we have to centralize in order to decentralize. We have to have a big state that runs the economy in order to get no state. We have to, in some cases around the world, revolutionaries have to engage in war because they're trying to get to a world without war. And it's a contradiction. It's hard to wrap your mind around, but it's very Hegelian. I think Haas would probably have a lot to say about this kind of thing because it fits. This is what Hegel was always trying to tell his followers, right? The unity of opposites, right? The concept of big and small are intrinsically tied in with each other. They may be opposites, but you can't have big without small. You cannot have tall without short. You cannot have light without darkness. There is no way to define light without defining darkness. There is no way to define darkness without defining light. Opposites are tied in with each other. This is the unity of opposites. This is a Marxist philosophical concept, the unity of opposites. And there's the negation of the negation, right? These are all Hegelian concepts. And yes, right, that in order to decentralize, we will need to centralize. I mean, it sounds contradictory, but it's not. So there you go. Here I am. Folks, bring folks back. Someone asked the difference between Marxism and socialism. South China Sea. All right, South China Sea. Right. China, Australia, UK, US alliance. All right, wrote it down. Thanks. The difference between Marxism and socialism. All right, so Marxism is the belief, it's scientific socialism. It's a philosophy, an economic school of thought, and a political school of thought developed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. It is a worldview that argues that eventually capitalism, we move from capitalism to socialism. It has dialectical materialism as its philosophical view. It has communism as its political view. And that it advocates moving towards socialism as a way of resolving the contradictions of capitalism. You can't have Caleb without Jabba the Hutt. That's very funny. That's very, very funny, Captain Waffles. It's that Marxism is a whole worldview and a whole school of thought. It's a way of understanding the world, and it is a specific political movement that has given rise to socialism around the world. Socialism is just a society where the means of production function according to public good and not profits. And there is non-Marxist socialism in the world. I would argue that all socialism, to one degree or other, is influenced by Marxism. And there's a lot of non-socialism in the world that's heavily influenced by Marxism as well. Marxism has been such a big political current that has such an impact on the world. Like Ba'athist Arab socialism is technically not Marxist. They use the term, what is it? They say it's scientific socialism. They say, well, we reject Marxism. There's aspects of it we like. It's heavily influenced by Marxism. Bolivarianism, they will say they're Marxist. They're heavily influenced by Marxists, but they're also Roman Catholic, but they have their Bolivarian interpretation. So, there's a lot of socialism in the world that's not explicitly Marxist, but it's heavily influenced. Socialism is an economic system. It is a system in which the banks, factories, and industries and the centers of economic power function for the good of society and not for the profits of a few. Marxism is an ideology. It is a worldview. It is a method of understanding the world, and those are two different things. Yes, and you can have socialism without Marxism, and that there are many non-socialist elements that are influenced by Marxism. And I would argue that a lot of academia nowadays draws heavily from Marxism to analyze art and culture, to explain the behavior of different forces. It draws heavily from Marxism, but not to achieve socialism. There's a lot of academic Marxism that is not socialist in any conceivable way, but it draws from Marxism. And postmodernism draws from Marxism as a vehicle for deconstruction. I've talked about that before. All righty. The Canadian elections. Well, Canada has to decide. Canada has to decide if it's going to continue to be a puppet of the United States. If I was Canadian, I'd be furious. Right, the fact the U.S. government uses Canada to grab, the Chinese communist leader Meng, or the Chinese leader of Huawei Technologies, Meng, the fact that the United States is dragging Canada into its wars and such. I mean, the Canadian people, the U.S. economy and the U.S. society is in a downward spiral, and the idea that they're going to drag Canada along with it. And I think there's probably a lot of Canadians who don't want that. So let's see where that ends up. Let's see how that ends up, and let's see what the results are. The proletarian side of the American Revolution. The proletarian side of the American Revolution. Well, it's true that in Boston and in New York, there were, in the cities that were developing in the 13 colonies, there were many proletarians. I think, there's a patriotic movie from the 1950s, Johnny Tremaine, and it's about this young man who's becoming an apprentice to be like, what is he trying to be, like a metal worker or something like that. And there were proletarians. Most of the settlers of the 13 colonies were planters. They were farmers. But there were urban wage workers, blacksmiths, masons, bricklayers, etc., that were a component of the American Revolution. And there were unions among those folks. They were the guilds, right? The crafts had their guilds that they were called. And a lot of the people who fought in the American Revolution for the American side, and again, this shows that it's complicated. A lot of them were proletarians or former indentured servants, and that's the other thing. A lot of the American proletariat at the time of the American Revolution had been indentured servants, which meant that they came to the United States with some wealthy person who paid for their journey. But then, in order to pay off the debt of having traveled to the United States with this wealthy person, they were basically a slave to this wealthy person for a few years. And sometimes 10 years, and sometimes 15 years, right? Indentured servitude, it was called, where you were a temporary slave. You weren't, for your whole life a slave. It was just, you made a deal, a deal with the person who brought you to the United States, that in exchange for bringing you to the United States, you would be their property. You would be their indentured servant for so many years. And many American proletarians were former indentured servants. They were people who had come to the United States, they'd done 10 or 15 years being the property of some rich person and being their indentured servant, and then after that they became wage workers, and they didn't have any property because they'd spent here 10, 15 years working for free. And yes, they did have far more rights than African slaves had. That's true, right? You couldn't murder your indentured servant. You couldn't rape your indentured servant. They were more protected than slaves were, no question about it. I know some people, there's this whole thing where some Irish people try to say, oh, we were slaves too, and then people step in and they say, well, you weren't really slaves. You were temporarily bonded to someone as an indentured servant, and yeah, there's no desire to belittle or try to belittle the experience of slavery. And what indentured servants went through was awful, but it wasn't anything like slavery. I mean, they were treated in a much more humane way than African slaves were, no doubt about it. And anyone who tries to tell you different, that's not honest. And but regardless, so indentured servitude, there was that. So you had a lot of proletarians in Boston and in New York and in the 13 colonies. Baltimore, right, was a city at the time. Baltimore, was a city in Maryland. And you had a lot of Atlanta, I believe, right, was in Georgia, which was a colony. It was named for King George. You had proletarians there who fought for the American side in the Revolution because they didn't want to be proletarians anymore. Because they were told that if they joined the army of George Washington and Benjamin Franklin and all of that, that they would get land, okay? And so the American Revolution had two sides to it, all right? On the one hand, you had Alexander Hamilton, and you had various progressive thinkers who said we need to not have the 13 colonies simply be a trading hub for the British Empire. We need to expand the U.S. economy. We need to, advance technology. We need economic growth. Okay. However, what did economic growth mean? It meant expanding westward and killing more indigenous people and seizing land. And Thomas Jefferson, right, he was very much, his economic theories did not pander to urban industrialists and inventors and such. His economic theories pandered very much to the people who had small farms, what he called the yeomen. And a lot of the proletarians who fought in the American Revolution, they were convinced that if they fought in the American Revolution, the British were telling the Americans they couldn't expand further westward, that would be lifted, the British would be defeated, and then they could go become small farmers. And part of the reason that, so after the defeat of the British, and you had the independence established for the 13 colonies, the first government that came into being was called the Articles of Confederation, and it was very loose. It was this very loose association, right, of 13 colonies. And part of the reason the U.S. Constitution was ratified was because of something called Shays' Whiskey Rebellion. And that was poor people. It was proletarians who had fought in the American Revolution who were mad because they didn't get the land. They'd been promised all this land, right? That the idea was, you're going to get some land if you fight in our revolution. And they didn't get it. And so they took up guns. And there was an armed uprising, Shays' Whiskey Rebellion. And it was brutally put down. A lot of people were executed for participating in it. I think a lot of people died. But it was very hard for the 13 colonies to put it down because every state was on its own. Each of the 13 colonies was on their own. And it was very hard for them to put it down, so they needed a central government. The U.S. Constitution was largely a central government created for the purpose of putting down proletarian uprisings. And actually read the preamble of the United States, right? The preamble of the Constitution. We the people, one of the lines is, in order to ensure domestic tranquility, right? That's a line from the preamble. In order to ensure domestic tranquility. That meant things like Shays' Whiskey Rebellion, these proletarians rising up and killing people because they didn't get any land. We need to make sure that doesn't happen, right? We need a central government, right? And, the Constitution of the United States refers a lot to insurrection. It refers a lot to the danger of some kind of armed insurrection against the government of the United States. If you read it, I mean, the only crime in the U.S. Constitution that you can get the death penalty for from the federal government is treason, right? If you engage in armed violence against the United States, they can execute you. And actually, the first person ever executed for treason was John Brown. It was not enforced. They didn't need to. There was not people who engaged in armed insurrection against the United States after the Constitution was written, except until you had John Brown. And they hung John Brown. It was a federal execution for treason. And that was one of the main reasons they wrote the U.S. Constitution, is so we had a federal government. So if somebody tried to do what Shays' Whiskey Rebellion did, we could kill them. And then the Constitution, you'll recall, there was a lot of people in the 13 colonies who didn't accept the Constitution. The Constitution of the United States, as it was written, the colonies wouldn't accept it. So it wasn't until the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution. It wasn't until the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution. All right, CPI Christianity book. All right. It wasn't until the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution that the colonists would accept it. CPI Christianity book. It wasn't until then that the 13 colonies would accept it. And the Bill of Rights, it's quite interesting. I'm going to sound like a conservative here, but the Bill of Rights originally only applied to the federal government, right? The idea of the Bill of Rights, it's the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. It wasn't saying that the states couldn't do these things. It was saying that the federal government would not do these things from a federal level. That was the idea. So, for example, the First Amendment of the United States, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or restricting free exercise thereof, or freedom of speech, or freedom of the press, or freedom of the people to peaceably assemble and petition the government. That's roughly what it says. I probably got a few words wrong there. What was that about? Well, the idea was that 9 of the 13 colonies had state religions. Did you know that? 9 of the 13 colonies had state religions. And there was a fear, many of the colonies, you have to remember, were formed because of religious disagreements. Massachusetts was run by the Puritans. And if you didn't get along with the Puritans, they were the state religion of Massachusetts. So I believe New Hampshire, if I'm not mistaken, was started by somebody among the Puritans who didn't agree with their religion, some religious leader, if I'm not mistaken, who then said, oh, well, I don't agree. I can't live here anymore because I'm a heretic. And he started his own, right? Pennsylvania was started by William Penn. And William Penn, right, was a Quaker. And Quakers were considered to be heretics. They were considered to be heretics by the Puritans. So William Penn and his Quakers, they couldn't be Quakers in Massachusetts. So they had to go and start Pennsylvania. Maryland, right, was for Roman Catholics. It was Mary's land, right? Catholics were considered to be awful heretics because they, honored, Saint Mary, the mother of Jesus, and that was considered to be a heresy. And so they had to start Maryland, right? And that the 13 colonies, a lot of the reason that they were separate, they weren't all one territory, was largely because of religious disagreements. So in order to get the 13 colonies to agree to have one central government, they had to have the First Amendment of the Constitution that said that basically we won't make a federal state religion. There will be no law respecting an establishment of religion, meaning there won't be a state religion for the United States. And number 2, we will not restrict free exercise thereof, meaning that we won't pass any federal laws that'll prevent you from being Catholic in Maryland, or you from being Quakers in Pennsylvania, or you from being, from being Puritans in Massachusetts. And that's why it was passed. The Second Amendment, right? The right to bear arms, right? What was that about? Well, the entire reason the American Revolution had started, in a lot of ways, it was because the British were noticing political differences developing between the 13 colonies and the British government, and they were nervous because they saw that so many of the American colonists had firearms. And so in order to try and prevent some kind of, what eventually happened, the American Revolution, they started confiscating people's guns. And there was a fear that if we set up a new central government that would be for the whole 13 colonies, and they wanted to start violating the rights of Maryland on behalf, if Maryland and New York teamed up against, against Virginia, they could go take Virginia's guns away to set the stage for going after Virginia. So, Second Amendment was, the right to bear arms. And if you read, the first 10 amendments of the U.S. Constitution, they are largely compromises to convince states that they would not, lose their ability to practice their own religion. The government wouldn't come and take their guns away. The Bill of Rights, and it's very funny because there's one thing in the Bill of Rights that nobody ever talks about. Which is that you cannot be forced to quarter soldiers. Did you notice? This was a big thing in the American Revolution. And there's actually an amendment of the U.S. Constitution that says you cannot be forced to quarter soldiers unless a state of war is declared. What was that? Well, the British Army in the colonies had this habit of showing up at people's houses and saying, all right, you are going to, take soldiers into your house and you're going to feed us and we get to stick around here however long we want because we're the army. We're the British Army and you have to, let us sleep over and you have to let us, eat your food. And, basically, and we have it in our Constitution that unless a state of war is declared, the Army cannot come to your house and force you to put up U.S. Army people as your house guests for free. Did you know that? I think that's hilarious. But yeah, think about it. Wouldn't that be awful if the U.S. Army just started coming to people's houses and saying, you know what, you're going to take us into your home, you're going to feed us, you're going to take care of us, and we're going to hang out in your house. We don't want to have barracks in the Army anymore. We're just going to stay at your place. Well, that is in the Constitution that you can't do that. You can't force people to quarter soldiers in their home. So, if you look at the U.S. Constitution, right, it was, again, right, it was written to attempt to put down some of the rebellions among the poor people and the proletarians. You had the competing viewpoint. You had Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson that had very opposite economic views. Um, you know, uh, you know, okay. Okay. I mean, I hope that answered your question. I hope that was a good answer to your question there about the proletarian side of the American Revolution. But look, Gerald Horne is right, right? That largely, I don't fully embrace the American Revolution. There were aspects of Hamiltonian economics that are progressive and anti-slavery that I can embrace. But look, Thomas Jefferson was a reactionary, and one of the main motivating factors of the American Revolution was that the British Empire was restricting the ability of the American colonists to spread westward and steal land from the Native Americans. And that's not a good thing, right? The British Empire, because of their worldview, their Atlanticist worldview, was restricting the ability. They didn't want to see the United States turned into a prosperous industrial country. They wanted the United States to remain. They saw the United States like they saw India or they saw Africa, right? They wanted it to be a poor trading hub that they could control, a poor trading hub and a captive market. That's what the Boston Tea Party was about, right? It was that basically I shouldn't say we, but the American colonists were being forced to buy products from British monopolies at overpriced amounts and taxation without representation, et cetera. And so, in protest of being forced to buy from British corporations, they dumped a bunch of tea into the harbor. The Boston Tea Party, it was called. So yeah, I mean, again, there are multiple sides. There are multiple sides to many events. Alexander Hamilton believed in economic growth. He believed in industrialization. Henry Carey, Friedrich List. There was a school of industrial capitalist thought that was basically opposed to capitalism developing into its imperialist monopoly stage, and believed there needed to be heavy state intervention in the economy in order to advance historical progress. And there's the harmony of interests and Henry Carey, and those economic theories, I would argue, are very progressive, and they were part of the American Revolution. They're not Marxist, and Marx recognized that they were not fully in line with his ideas. Marx said that Henry Carey was the only American economist of any worth, of any worth, right? Marx studied Henry Carey's economic theories. He respected Henry Carey to some degree or other, but his theories, Marxism, is very different than Henry Carey and Hamiltonian economics. But Hamiltonian economics is way better than Thomas Jefferson's, settler populist libertarianism, and it's also way better than obviously Adam Smith and free trade economics from the British Empire. But the American Revolution had multiple sides, right? And so, I don't fully embrace the American Revolution. I embrace, some aspects of it as being progressive, but you read the Declaration of Independence, right? A lot of what's in the Declaration of Independence is you're holding us back and you're not enabling us to go plunder the whole country and kill all the Native Americans. And you can't embrace that. If you're a progressive person, you can't support that. You can't support that. And I guess I'll keep going. If people have more super chats they want me to talk about, keep them rolling in. I'll keep talking about stuff. But I guess, it's funny because, around Christmas time, there's a hymn that you will hear. There's a very famous hymn that you will hear around Christmas time, right? We three kings of Orient are, bearing gifts we traverse afar. It's a Christmas song, right? We three kings. What is the chorus of We Three Kings? Westward leading, still proceeding, guide us to thy perfect light. What the hell is that? Westward leading, still proceeding, guide us to thy perfect light. Well, you have to look at when We Three Kings was written. Obviously, it wasn't written in ancient Palestine when Jesus was born. It was not even written in Europe. It was written in New York City. It was written in New York City in the 1800s. And at the time in New York City, there was a newspaper called the New York Tribune that hired Karl Marx. And the owner of that newspaper was Horace Greeley. And Horace Greeley was a utopian socialist and a progressive, an abolitionist who was opposed to slavery. And his slogan that he used everywhere, the slogan of Horace Greeley, the slogan was, Go west, young man. Go west, young man. That was the slogan of Horace Greeley, that he said, go west, young man. That was his slogan. So the fact that in New York City, for the big Christmas pageant in like 1870 or whatever, that they wrote this song just for the Christmas pageant, and the chorus was, westward leading, still proceeding, guide us to the perfect light. It's manifest destiny, right? But, and this is what makes it complicated, Horace Greeley, yes, he was saying go westward, which meant expand westward, steal land from Native Americans. That's what it meant. But Horace Greeley was opposed to slavery. Horace Greeley was kind of a utopian socialist. He wasn't a Marxist, but he hired Karl Marx to write for his newspaper. Horace Greeley was largely a progressive, but his progressivism, go west, young man, was tied in with anti-indigenous, settler colonialism. These things are complicated, right? They're very, very complicated, right? And this is why I argue that we can't just tell all the American, we can't just be anti-patriotic, and we can't just say all of America is evil, we hate everything about America. We just can't do that. Because within America, there are certain cultural tropes that could be harnessed for socialism. Anna Louise Strong, the communist writer who I love, Anna Louise Strong, in her writing, she references, she says that the Americans are a motor-minded people. We have a go-get 'em attitude. We're live wires. We go and get things done. We work hard. And that she found the American spirit was very alive in the Soviet Union. She found that in the Soviet Union, that during the 5-year plans, when Stalin was mobilizing the population to go out and build a new country, she said that that was the American spirit, that the Soviet Union was the new America, right? And that, socialism is a fundamentally optimistic ideology. It is an ideology that believes in community and brotherhood and spirit and building and working hard to build something beautiful, right? To build a whole new world, right? We can get to a stateless, classless world. We can achieve heaven on earth. When kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, that we can build a world without oppression. We can build a world, but it's going to require hard work, and it's going to require great sacrifice, but it's sacrifice for this optimism. And so, the narrative of communism, you can find all throughout American history. Unfortunately, that narrative, that belief that we're going to get to a better life, but we're going to do it by working hard and sacrificing until we can get to the utopia we achieve. The spirit of the 5-year plans in Stalin, you can find that all over U.S. society. Westward leading, still proceeding, guide us to the perfect light. You can find it, right? It's there, right? Unfortunately, it was just used, these desires to go out and hard work and sacrifice and struggle for what is right until we achieve, that heaven on earth. That was utilized to support, westward expansion, genocide of the native people. But who's to say that this desire to work hard and struggle and sacrifice in order to achieve the things that you believe in? Who's to say that this religious fanaticism, this belief that we believe in our principles so much and that we are going to go out and build communities around our principles, the things that made, like the Mormons, go westward to Utah, the principles that made my ancestor Charles G. Finney leave this city of New York and go to Ohio and start Oberlin College. Who's to say that those sentiments could not be used to build a mass socialist movement, right? Who's to say that the fanaticism within the American spirit, the desire to go out and work hard and sacrifice and struggle for justice and stick true to your principles, who's to say that couldn't be used for socialism? But if we just dismiss all of that, if socialism just becomes pessimism, if it just becomes a way to express your rage at society, we'll never hijack those principles. We need to figure out how to do a better job of hijacking those principles, I would argue. We need to figure out how we can fit Marxism, anti-imperialism, and socialism into the American spirit. That's the only chance we've got. If we remain an incel, isolated movement, then we have no hope. All right. Keep the super chats rolling in, folks. I'll be on here a little while longer. I've got 3 super chats left. It seems. And then when they're done, I guess I'm done. But I'll keep going. We'll see. Nihilism is BS. Everything is impossible until it's done. Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, when people have no hope, when they have no reason to wake up in the morning, they have nothing to believe in, nothing to sacrifice for, that's very, very dangerous. Ideology is what, I've used the analogy many times of driving a car. When you're driving a car, you know where you're going, you know where you came from, you know how you're getting there. And that's ideology. Ideology tells you where you came from, it tells you where you're going, and it tells you how you're getting there. That's what ideology does for people. When you rob people of ideology, when you tell them that there is no truth, postmodernism, it says there is no truth, there is no grand narrative, it robs people of ideology. And suddenly people don't know where they're going. They don't know where they came from. They don't know how they're getting there. And when you don't know where you're going, and when you don't know where you came from, and you don't know how you're getting there, then you stop the car. You stop the car at that point because you don't know where you're going. I mean, and that's what's happening. And the rise of suicide and the rise of drug addiction and the mental health crisis facing the United States, all of this is because ideology has been broken down. Right? There's a cultural crisis that began with the synthetic left in the 1960s. Right? The original left was not anti-ideology. The Communist Party, it fought against the ideology of capitalism, but it gave them a new ideology called Marxism-Leninism. But the new left was against all ideology. It was against all ideology, against all truth. And so that suddenly set in, and you had opposition to all ideology and all truth, and that leads to a society falling apart. And the CIA, at first they were just pushing doctrinaire anti-communism, but through their work with Project MKUltra and through their, brainwashing experiments, you can read the book The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, which is a very good book by John D. Marks. It talks about how the CIA realized that it was far more effective, and thank you, David Fox, I much appreciated your contribution. It was far more effective to fight communism by promoting postmodernism and by promoting nuance and relativism and arguing that there is no truth. That was a far more effective way of fighting communism. And Project MKUltra and CIA brainwashing experiments, they realized that introducing nuance, introducing pessimism, introducing confusion, getting people high on drugs, all of that was a way of taking away people's passion, taking away people's desire to sacrifice for things, and that was a way to secure U.S. society to prevent communist revolution. There wouldn't be a communist revolution if people were not, willing to sacrifice for things, if people did not believe that truth exists. And this was the conclusion. I mean, if you read The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, after years of research and thought experiments and they worked very hard and they developed postmodernism as a way to combat communism. But they didn't seem to realize that was going to come around and bite them in the ass, right? Because, the U.S. society also, it's not just communism that runs on ideology. All societies run on ideology. All societies run on meaning. All societies run centered around certain truths. So if you get rid of truth entirely, not only will the communists go away, but also your society is going to come apart. And that's basically what happened. I mean, it's like you can imagine that postmodernism is like an acid, right? Imagine a vat of acid, okay? And so it's like, the USA, it takes this vat of acid and it throws it on the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union is hit with the acid and it corrodes. And they say, we got them. But then the acid is still there. And suddenly the acid comes towards the United States. And suddenly it's all over the United States. And the United States is corroded. That's basically what they did. Postmodernism is a vat of acid. They used it to corrode the Soviet Union. It worked. But the acid kept going. And now the acid is coming back and it's corroding the United States, right? That this pessimism, this lack of belief in truth, this lack of willingness to sacrifice is a purely destructive force. It destroys civilizations. It destroys societies. But it doesn't replace them with anything. It just destroys them, right? And the Roman Empire was infected with a very similar belief, right? The adoption of Christianity by the Roman Empire was a desperate move. It was a very desperate move because Roman society, it started out when Roman society began. It was a pessimistic, authoritarian, tribalist mentality. But gradually you saw the rise in Roman society of the Stoicist movement, which was very much postmodernism. and Rome was coming apart. And so they adopted Christianity, which Christianity, by the time the Romans adopted Christianity as their official religion, they had watered it down, they had changed it, they had changed, but it was in a desperate attempt to try and keep their empire together because their founding ideology had been so widely eroded and replaced with this kind of stoic, pessimist hopelessness. And Christianity was an attempt. It was an attempt to use some of the teachings of the Christian religion, which had been the revolutionary movement of the proletariat against the Roman Empire. It was an attempt to try and reinvigorate their empire with some of the passion of Christianity. But in order for them to accept Christianity, they had to water it down so much that it became meaningless. And the Roman Empire fell. And the founding myths of U.S. society have been refuted. Good, right? They're bad founding myths. The ideology of U.S. society has been refuted. Good, great. The Confederate monuments are being ripped down. Good, that's all good, but we're not replacing it with anything. We're just replacing it with deconstruction. And deconstruction doesn't build anything. You can't build anything with deconstruction. You can't build anything with deconstruction. And that's my point. Postmodernism and liberalism are a destructive force in the world, and just left to their own devices, they only lead to further deconstruction. People want to build. Human beings are tool-making creatures. They're inventors. They're innovators. And if you tell them that there is no hope, if you tell them that there is no reason to exist, they're not going to do very well. They're not going to do very well. The South China Sea, the Australia, UK, and U.S. alliance, nuclear fission. All right. So the Australia-U.S. alliance. All right. So there's this alliance that's been formed in the South China Sea between the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia. France is furious about it because they have islands in the South China Sea area that they were not consulted. They were not allowed to be part of this. And this indicates the distance between the European mainland and the U.S. and the U.K. getting stronger. Absolutely. That's what this indicates. But furthermore, why is the South China Sea so important to China? Because they are dependent on foreign oil, right? China, they need oil to run their economy, and they don't have very much domestic oil. They import most of their oil, and it comes on oil tankers through the South China Sea, right? The port of Shanghai and other ports in the south of China is where the oil tends to be imported from. And at any point, the United States could shut down China's economy by blockading, setting up a naval blockade in the South China Sea. So the USA has been increasing its military presence in the South China Sea to threaten China on this point. To say basically to China, look, we have the ability to shut down your economy at any point, so do what we say. Now, China doesn't want this to happen. So it's been increasing its military presence in the South China Sea because of the fact that it wants to not have its economy shut down. That's what this is about. And that's, China basically wants to be able to continue to have its economy grinding ahead, doesn't want the USA to be able to veto their economy, to shut down the flow of oil, to cut off their ports. That's basically what it's about. The United States wants the ability to have maritime dominance and to lock China out of the global maritime trade routes. China doesn't want that to happen. The fact that France wasn't consulted, that's pretty awful. U.S., U.K., and Australia, that's an Atlanticist alliance, if there ever was such a thing. And that's the Atlanticist, that's the Adam Smith free trade model. Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, any comments on it? I just discovered it online. France is also furious with the cancellation of its submarine contract by the Australian government. Wow, I didn't know about that. Wow, this could get bigger. This could get much bigger. But yeah, this is increasingly, look, the European mainland and the British and the Americans have long been at odds with each other, right? The British and the Americans control the oil markets. The oil is their thing. So that's why France, Germany, and other European mainland countries have been so enthusiastic about nuclear power, because that means they're not dependent on the British and the Americans for oil. And the USA has long been very opposed to nuclear power. And in fact, the USA Israel killed French citizens, right? You'll remember when Saddam Hussein was building a nuclear power reactor, Israel bombed their facility in Iraq, and they killed not only Iraqis, but they killed a French citizen. And that the European mainland has long felt like its future is not tied in with the British and the Americans. And that's what World War I was about. The Central Powers, Austria-Hungary, Germany, and the Ottomans, fighting against the British and the French and the Americans, right? That's what this is. That's basically what World War I was. After World War I, Germany and Austria-Hungary, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they were stripped of their colonies. And then, the industrial capitalists of Germany, they put Hitler into power and tried to get their colonies back. And that was World War II. And this contradiction, this is one of the defining contradictions of Western imperialism, is that the French, the Germans, the Austrians, the Belgians, they've never really been on an equal footing with the British and the Americans. The British and the Americans are the top dogs of imperialism. The British were the first ones. They started to fade after World War I, and the Americans stepped up, but they are the ones that run imperialism, okay? And the Germans, the French, the Italians, the Spaniards, they've never, even though these are Western imperialist countries, they've never been part of the club. And they resent that. And that's really been the defining rivalry. And within the United States, the Democrats favor doing everything they can to keep the NATO alliance intact. Barack Obama went and campaigned in Berlin. Do you remember that when he was running for president? Whereas the Republicans are kind of like, screw Europe. We don't care. Right? If the Europeans want to go their own way, fine. Donald Trump dissed NATO all the time. And so we shall see how long the NATO alliance lasts. But yeah, this spat between France. Do you remember freedom fries? Right? In the United States, we started calling French fries freedom fries. They're not even from France. It's just a French cut. They're cut in a French cut. It's not called, they're not from France. French fries are not from France, but they call them French fries. They called them freedom fries. It was just so ridiculous. All right, the CPI book on Christianity, it's almost done being laid out. I'm talking with the layout guy. We're making some adjustments. Should be out next week, I would think. I mean, it's really pretty much done. I need to email the layout guy later today and give him a couple points, and we're moving right ahead. It's pretty much almost done. Nuclear fusion. Fusion City now. Look, fusion energy is the hope for humanity to break free from the trap called fossil fuels. I've talked about Fusion City. I think we need to develop, Republican anti-war populism. We need to develop more of a thorough proposal for Fusion City. And I hope that the Center for Political Innovation, we want to develop a commission within the group so we can have a formal written out proposal for Fusion City. Absolutely. That's absolutely. So what about Medicare for all, socialized health care? Okay. Medicare for all, socialized health care. So that absolutely needs to be done. And that Fusion City, our vision for Fusion City is a very optimistic, progressive vision. It goes along with the Sandino-Zapata economic corridor. So there you go. Republican anti-war populism. Well, it's largely rooted in the fact that many Americans in red states who have to go and fight these wars are getting tired of them. And, the left has become synonymous with liberal social values and social liberalism and spreading it all over the world. The right wing is now taking up the banner of anti-establishment views and populism, etc. We have a job to do. We got to counter this. And again, as I said at the beginning of this, way back before we had to stop and start again and stop and start again, I warned people about how the right wing was stealing the mantle of anti-interventionism and stuff. And nobody listened to me. No, they just kept doing their liberal thing, build the movement. Well, I say out of the movement to the masses. Out of the movement to the masses. And that's why I say it, is because, the fact that now anti-war views are almost entirely in the Republican camp at this point, it seems, that's horrifying. But that's a result of the failure of the left. The left has embedded itself so much with the Democrats that as a result of that, anti-establishment sentiments are on the right. Again, we should have no loyalty to the Democrats or the Republicans. We just want to get to the masses, right? Out of the movement to the masses, right? So there you go. As far as the Medicare for All thing, I think the Medicare for All marches are great. I think they're tremendous. Talking to them about the need for fully socialized health care, well, that's a conversation you can have, but the energy of the Medicare for All marches seems to be around Medicare for All. And the fact that AOC, the fact that the Young Turks are condemning these marches, not embracing them, and demonizing the participants means they're the cutting edge, right? The Medicare for All marches are the cutting edge, right? Because of the fact that the synthetic left is condemning them when it's a demand they supposedly agree with. And the voices embracing the Medicare for All marches tend to be anti-war and anti-imperialist. That's a really good sign. So I don't feel like the approach of CPI to the Medicare for All marches should be one of hostility, one of like, well, actually the solution is full socialized medicine. I feel like the approach just needs to be a full-on embrace. These people are not only fighting against the medical, the private insurance, rip-off scheme of the United States. They're fighting against the synthetic left, and I think that anything to support the movement for Medicare for All, anything to support the voices leading that movement, Jimmy Dore, Jackson Hinkle, Convo Couch, anything to support those voices needs to be done. And that, I saw when people were talking about AOC's dress, when people were talking about it, one thing I noticed was people were saying, oh, the far left does nothing, but they complain about a dress. And it's like, no, they had a whole big mobilization, a Medicare for All march. Do you remember that? They had a Medicare for All march, and all the liberals, all the DSA liberals boycotted it. Remember that? So that's just kind of malarkey, and that, the Jacobin crowd, Young Turks, BreadTube, they're trying to calm they're trying to prevent a struggle from breaking out for Medicare for All. So the fact that Jimmy Dore and all these other forces have mobilized to actually keep a struggle going for Medicare for All, that is really significant. And the fact that the synthetic left says that it's Nazi and it's fascist and you're a red-brown, you're a neo-Nazi white supremacist if you want Medicare for All, that shows how threatened the fake left really is by the Medicare for All march. And that shows that that's where you need to be, right? I mean, the people that are there are the people that could be won to the city-building tendency. They're already willing to fight and clash with the synthetic left. They're already mostly anti-war and anti-imperialist. They're breaking out of the movement mindset. Oh, we can't talk to anybody on the right because they're on the right. We can't talk to them. They're breaking out of it. Jimmy Dore gets better every day. Jimmy Dore gets better every day. And that's obviously where we need to be. Leo Strauss is a philosophy professor. He was a philosophy professor in the United States. He was at New School University for a while and then at the University of Chicago. And he pushed the idea of the philosopher kings, right? And that basically he argued that a lot of philosophical writing from the time of Plato up until today was censored because philosophers couldn't say what they really believed because of political repression. And he argued that it was the duty of intellectuals, it was the duty of the philosopher kings and the smart people to protect freedom by controlling the rabble, that the rabble getting together and mobilizing are a threat to freedom. And I have his book, Persecution and the Art of Writing, and he argues that you can read philosophical texts. There's like encrypted messages for philosophers, and then there's like the mass interpretation, there's also, you talk about his favorite TV show was Gunsmoke, because on Gunsmoke, the good guys wore a white hat, the bad guys wore a black hat. And that showed that there was no ambiguity, and that's how average people should be led to understand politics in this simplistic way. You need simplistic propaganda for the masses. Leo Strauss was a pretty evil person. And his worldview, that's what Vosh thinks. That's also what the neocons think, right? It's anti-populism. It's doctrinaire anti-populism. It equates Nazism and communism. It's the worldview of Hannah Arendt. Traditional uranium reactors, well, look, they have problems. They have problems. Look, nuclear power as it currently exists, nuclear waste. I did a whole thing about how Japan is going to be dumping, nuclear waste into the ocean. I'm for nuclear power. It's an option, but it has problems, right? It has big problems. I mean, it's not better than fossil fuels. It's not. It's not worse than fossil fuels, I should say, but it has problems. I'm not against nuclear power, but nuclear power, as it currently exists, has big problems. No doubt about it. But it is a threat to the power of big oil. That's the main reason that there was an anti-nuclear movement. Big oil companies have been the main backers of the anti-nuclear movement from the beginning, right? Because it represents a potential threat to the oil-based global order. And that's why China and the Soviet Union and Iran and other countries have been so in favor of nuclear power, is because nuclear power means not being dependent on big Western oil monopolies. And the movement against nuclear power kind of fit in. And I've got this book on the synthetic left. I'm editing it. I want to get it right. But I talk about how the anti-nuclear movement was kind of the opening for the left to become, what it is today, the synthetic left to become what it is today. The nuclear movement, that was kind of a turning point. So there you go. All right, folks, I think we'll cut it off here. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression, but the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. And while the danger of a new world war still exists and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. We need a government of action that will fight for working families out of the movement to the masses, out of the movement to the masses, out of the movement to the masses. Dare to struggle, dare to win. Good night, folks. Good night.